How old were the first families, and did cavemen even have teenagers? Hey everyone, tonight, we're drifting back into a world so quiet, so slow, and so unbelievably simple that even your sleepiest afternoon nap would look hectic by comparison. So go ahead and dim the lights, settle your shoulders, and let your breathing fall into that soft, steady rhythm, because we're going somewhere older than kings, older than pyramids, older even than the first person who looked at a rock and thought, I could probably sharpen this and poke someone with it. We're drifting deep into the world of the first families, those early humans, whose lives shaped everything that eventually became us. And yes, we'll even talk about whether cavemen had teenagers, because it turns out the answer is both funny and very human. Most people imagine early humans as cave dwellers, but the truth is far softer. Most didn't live in caves at all. They slept in simple shelters along rivers, on grassy plains, or beneath rock overhangs. A cave was just emergency housing, like the prehistoric version of crashing at a friend's place. Real daily life happened outside, where morning sunlight spread gently across the land, and the only alarm clock was wind and the grass. Families gathered around fires that smelled like smoke, damp earth, and the faint hint of last night's roasted roots. Their world was made of sky, animals, seasons, and the steady rhythm of survival. And here's where things get interesting. Early parents were astonishingly young by modern standards. Many girls became mothers around 14 to 18, and boys became fathers around 16 to 20. Not because they were magically mature, but because life was short, unpredictable, and had absolutely no patience for self-discovery phases. But even with these early responsibilities, their emotional world wasn't so different from ours. Which brings us to one of the most surprising truths. Yes, cavemen absolutely had teenagers. Maybe not the word, but definitely the behavior rolling. Mood swings, dramatic sighs, and that unique teenage ability to look annoyed at absolutely everything. The difference was that prehistoric teens didn't have time to be fully unbearable. They were too busy gathering plants, tracking animals, carrying wood, and making sure they didn't get eaten by things larger than them. People often hear that early humans only lived to 30, but that's a misleading number. Because so many infants died young, the average looks low. In reality, if someone survived childhood, they often reached 40, 50, and sometimes even 60. And an elder, wrinkled, gray-haired, and full of memories, was treasured. They carried knowledge like a living library. When rivers flooded, where herds migrated, which plants healed, and which ones caused an afternoon of regrettable decisions. They were the gentle navigators of a world without maps, and everyone relied on them because wisdom was as essential as fire. Daily life wasn't the action-packed chaos the movies show. Real life was slow. Long stretches of walking through grasslands. Hours of preparing food, shaping stones, weaving baskets, tending fires, watching the horizon, waiting for animals to appear. People spent a lot of time sitting together, talking softly, telling stories, teasing one another, or simply listening to the crackle of flames. It was a peaceful world, in its own rugged way, a world where survival depended on patience. Not drama. Family structures were larger and more fluid than ours. A family wasn't two parents and a couple of kids. It was a wide web. Parents, siblings, cousins, aunts, uncles, grandparents. People adopted in after joining the group, and anyone who became part of their routine. Children were raised communally. No one said, "These are my kids and those are your kids." They belonged to everyone. Aunts comforted them. Uncles taught them to hunt. Elders told them stories. And even teenagers, when they weren't quietly judging the universe, played their part. Privacy didn't exist, but support did. And that support is what helped humans survive ice ages, predators, and the kind of hardship modern people wouldn't tolerate for 5 minutes. These early humans weren't strange, distant creatures. They were us just without the noise of modern life. They laughed, argued, loved, worried, raised families, and built their days around routines so familiar that if you stripped away electricity and supermarkets, you'd recognize the rhythm instantly. Their world was quieter, but not emptier, harder, but not hopeless, simpler, but not dull. And tonight, as you drift towards sleep, you can imagine them moving through their days with the same hopes, fears, frustrations, and tiny triumphs that make us human, now that we've settled into the quiet rhythm of early human life. Let's drift a little deeper softly, like smoke rising from a slow fire into the moments that made up their days. Because while movies insist our ancestors spent most of their time dramatically sprinting away from predators, the truth is far gentler. Early humans were masters of not doing very much at all, and honestly, they were healthier for it. Their world rewarded patience, waiting, watching, listening. It was a place where silence wasn't uncomfortable, just another part of the landscape. Like a sleeping lion, you politely pretended not to notice. Most mornings began with the sun slowly warming the air, nudging people awake more gently than any modern alarm ever will. There were no clocks, no schedules, no meetings, no notifications buzzing from pockets. People rose when their bodies felt like rising. Some children stretched sleepily on woven mats. Others burrowed under fur blankets, hoping no one would notice they were awake. Adults, meanwhile, sat by the embers of last night's fire, coaxing the flame back to life with practiced hands. A small spark, a little breath. And suddenly the world had warmth again. After that came breakfast, or rather, the prehistoric version of breakfast. There were no pancakes, no coffee, no cereal with suspiciously colorful marshmallows. Instead, there were berries, nuts, leftover roasted roots, maybe a small piece of dried meat if the previous day's hunt had gone well. Food was simple, eaten quietly, with the soft morning light drifting across faces that looked older than their years and yet somehow more peaceful than ours. Adults soon slipped into the rhythms of work. Though work in ancient times didn't resemble anything we'd call a job, it was more like a steady dance with the environment. Men and women both gathered plants, dug for roots, and checked traps set the night before. Hunting was rarer than movies suggest, too risky to do every day, but when it happened, it was slow, patient, coordinated. Hunters tracked animals for hours, sometimes days, reading footprints the way modern people read text messages. A bent blade of grass, a disturbed patch of earth, a faint smell carried on the wind. These were their signals, their notifications, their guides. Back at camp, children wandered in small clusters, half playing, half learning. No schools, no grades, no homework, just constant observation. They watched adults weave baskets, chip stones, shape tools, and scrub hides. They imitated everything, whether they understood it or not. A toddler might help by tapping two rocks together with great seriousness, creating absolutely nothing useful but receiving warm smiles anyway. Early humans understood something modern parents sometimes forget. Children learn best by simply being included. And while childhood was shorter back then, it wasn't the bleak, miserable existence people imagine. Yes, life was hard. Yes, illness was common. But children also had more freedom than almost any child today. They explored forests, climbed rocks, splashed in rivers, poked questionable things with sticks, and invented games with nothing more than imagination and perhaps a particularly interesting pebble. Life had danger, but danger taught caution, naturally, without lectures. Meanwhile, elders, the real treasures of early communities, sat near the fire, legs wrapped in warm furs, watching everything with the patient resignation of someone who has already survived several natural disasters, 3 near-death experiences, and at least one relative with terrible decision-making skills. They told stories not just to entertain, but to teach. Every tale carried wisdom: how to track deer, when the river floods, which berries will ruin your week, and why you really shouldn't wander off alone after dark, unless you want an exciting but very short adventure. Their stories shaped the minds of everyone who listened. They wove memories into myths, turning real dangers into cautionary tales. A child wandering near a cliff. Once upon a time, a spirit lived there. Someone ignoring the weather. There was a legend about sudden storms punishing the careless. Nature wasn't an enemy or a friend. It was a presence, a personality. Something to be respected, understood, and occasionally bribed with offerings of berries, smoke, or whispered prayers. At midday, life slowed. The sun grew hot. People rested, yes, actually rested. They sat in shade, shared food, repaired tools, braided rope, or simply stared at clouds drifting across a sky unbothered by human concerns. This was the closest ancient humans came to self-care. There were no scented candles or mindfulness apps. But lying on soft grass while the wind ruffled your hair came pretty close in the afternoons. Groups sometimes moved camp and carried everything on their backs: baskets, tools, furs, children, and occasionally each other. Moving wasn't chaotic, it was gentle. People talked, sang, joked, and complained in that universal tone humans use when carrying heavy objects over long distances. They found new places to settle, places with fresh water, safe shelter, and hopefully fewer insects than the last spot.
How did ancient soldiers deal with boredom between wars? The long wait tonight, or drifting back to the quiet spaces between the battles, to the long sun-baked stretches of time when ancient soldiers were not marching, or fighting, or dying heroically, but mostly just waiting, because, as it turns out, that's what armies did most of the time. They waited for orders, for pay, for someone important to make a decision, for the weather to improve, and, very occasionally, for an enemy who never actually showed up. So tonight's story isn't about the clash of bronze and blood. It's about the dull ache of boredom, the heavy smell of tents and sweat, and the odd little ways that soldiers, Roman, Greek, Persian, Egyptian, and everything in between, tried to fill their endless, dusty days. So, make yourself comfortable. Turn down the lights, and let's drift back to the quieter side of ancient war, the side where nothing happens for weeks on end. If you picture the armies of the ancient world, you probably imagine motion, marching columns, drums, trumpets, the whole cinematic thing. But in reality, ancient warfare was mostly waiting around. Roman legions, for example, spent far more time building, repairing, and sitting inside their forts than they ever did in combat. They'd spend entire summers marching to a campaign only to fight 1 or 2 actual battles, and then go home again to sit quietly in winter quarters. Think of it as a job that involved about 10% action and 90% maintenance, which, honestly, is probably true of most jobs. Now, the Roman military was particularly good at keeping men busy, because Rome's generals understood something crucial. A bored soldier is a dangerous soldier. So, they worked them constantly. If you were a Roman legionary stationed on the German frontier, you could expect to spend your days digging ditches, cutting timber, repairing roads, polishing armor, and constructing elaborate defensive walls. Often in places no one would ever bother to attack. They built bridges, they quarried stone, they made bricks, they even landscaped. The Roman historian Vegetius once wrote that training was the soldiers' recreation, which sounds like the kind of thing only someone who wasn't actually doing the training would say, but not every army was so industrious. Let's drift over to ancient Greece, where soldiers were often mercenaries, hired for a season, then left to fend for themselves until someone else needed killing. Greek mercenaries, in their downtime, became professional loiterers. They played dice. They drank. They gambled away their pay. And when the money ran out, they sometimes just didn't leave. One of our best sources for this is Xenophon's Anabasis, a travelogue that's equal parts survival story and grumpy travel diary. He describes thousands of stranded Greek soldiers wandering across Persia after a failed campaign, bored, hungry, and deeply irritated with each other. At one point, to pass the time, they start putting on plays, literal stage performances in the middle of nowhere, because nothing cures existential despair like amateur theater. The Greeks, in general, were great believers in using games to stay sane. They wrestled, raced, boxed, and threw javelins, partly to stay fit, but mostly because there wasn't much else to do. They also held symposia, drinking parties, which were supposed to be intellectual gatherings, but often dissolved into philosophical arguments about who could drink the most without dying. If you were lucky enough to be in an Athenian garrison, you might even spend your downtime debating ethics with your commander, which is either stimulating or deeply exhausting, depending on how much wine you've had. Meanwhile, in ancient Egypt, soldiers had a slightly more structured sort of boredom. The Egyptian army, especially during the New Kingdom, was essentially part military, part construction crew. When there weren't wars to fight, the pharaohs used their soldiers for building projects, temples, roads, and monuments. So, while civilian workers carved the fine details, soldiers did the heavy hauling. It wasn't exactly thrilling, but it kept them employed, and it gave the pharaohs a convenient way to remind everyone that the army served him, even in peace. There are papyrus records of Egyptian soldiers being sent on fishing expeditions, quarry trips, and even agricultural work, because, of course, a ruler could never have too much free labor. It's hard to imagine a modern general telling his troops, "All right, men, put down the spears. We're planting barley this week." But for the Egyptians, that was perfectly normal. Let's drift north again, to the Roman frontiers. The damp, muddy edges of civilization, where thousands of legionaries lived in neat wooden forts, staring out at forests full of people who didn't particularly want them there. It rained a lot, and most of the time nothing happened, so they wrote letters. hundreds of them. Archaeologists have found thin wooden tablets from places like Vindolanda in Britain, letters from Roman soldiers stationed far from home. One complains about the cold, another asks for socks, a third, politely, begs for more beer. These men were supposed to be the conquerors of the known world, and their biggest concerns were laundry and alcohol, which really makes them very relatable. Inside the forts, there were small taverns, bathhouses, and makeshift temples. There were board games. The Roman version of checkers, known as ludus latrunculorum, was a favorite. They carved game boards into the stones of the barracks floors and played endlessly, often gambling their pay. They also brought pets. Dogs were common, sometimes cats, occasionally monkeys. One legionary in Egypt even left behind an epitaph for his pet parrot. So, yes, somewhere out there was a Roman soldier who marched across deserts and killed barbarians, only to mourn a talking bird. The army also offered entertainment of a sort: wrestling matches, mock battles. Music. If someone had a lyre or flute handy, and inevitably alcohol. Wine was the great social glue of the ancient world, and soldiers were its most enthusiastic consumers. Roman camps even had designated wine merchants, who followed the army wherever it went. So, while they couldn't always get home, they could at least get drunk. Now, if you were unlucky enough to be stationed somewhere truly remote, say, a desert outpost in the Persian Empire, things got even duller. The Persian army was vast, disciplined, and surprisingly well organized. But when there was no campaign, most soldiers simply became farmers again. They were citizen soldiers, called up for a season, and then sent home. Those stationed permanently at forts along the royal roads lived quiet, repetitive lives, tending gardens, maintaining horses, and occasionally collecting taxes. A Persian courier might gallop by with news from the capital, but otherwise nothing much happened. It was less epic empire and more rural postal service. Even the mighty Macedonian phalanx, the fearsome army of Alexander the Great, spent more time sitting in tents than conquering. During long marches, when no battles were in sight, Alexander's men played games, raced horses, and held impromptu singing contests. They also complained constantly. One chronicler notes that when Alexander's troops were delayed for weeks in the mountains of Bactria, they became so restless they started carving jokes onto rocks. Imagine traveling halfway across the known world to etch "Philip was here" into a boulder. When the boredom got unbearable, they'd pick fights with each other, or with local villagers, which was not ideal for diplomacy. Alexander eventually instituted regular drills just to stop them from rioting out of sheer tedium. Of course, not all soldiers dealt with boredom quietly. Some went a little off-script. In the late Roman Empire, there are records of legions stationed so long in one place that they started farming, intermarrying, and essentially forgetting they were an army. By the time orders came to move, many simply refused. It's hard to march when your cows are calving and your children are enrolled. In the local temple school, the empire quietly disbanded a few of these accidentally retired units. History doesn't record their names, which is probably for the best. Let's drift back to the heart of Rome again, where veterans gathered after retirement. Roman veterans were granted land or pensions, and, having spent 20 years digging ditches and polishing armor, they often found civilian life unbearably quiet. Some started small businesses. Others joined local militias. A few just sat around the forums, telling increasingly exaggerated stories about the time they almost met Julius Caesar. They also formed social clubs, collegia, essentially Roman veterans' associations, where they met to drink, reminisce, and occasionally stage mock battles with wooden swords. It was, in a way, the ancient version of retirees at a community center arguing about whose war was harder. And through it all, in Egypt, Greece, Rome, Persia, the same pattern repeats. When there's no fighting, soldiers build, drink, gamble, write, and wait. They grow restless. They complain about the weather. They carve their names into walls, and, every so often, they get called back to battle. And remember why boredom wasn't such a bad thing after all. So next time you picture an ancient warrior, gleaming in armor and standing proudly on a battlefield, remember that most of his life was spent sitting on a wooden stool, carving dice from animal bones, and wondering if today might finally be the day something happened. Spoiler, it usually wasn't. What did medieval executioners do when there were no executions? The man with the axe and nothing to do tonight. We're drifting back to a world where justice was loud, bloody, and oddly festive. Where entire towns gathered to watch a man with a very sharp blade perform the final act of the law. But tonight, we're not here for the executions. We're here for the silences between them, the long stretches of quiet days when the scaffold stood empty, and the man who usually worked there had to find something else to do. So, dim the lights, settle in, and let's drift into the strange, lonely, and surprisingly bureaucratic life of the medieval executioner, and again to the offspring of Catherine of Aragon and Henry VIII, when the latter declared his first marriage void. Suddenly, their daughter Mary, who had been Princess of Wales, was downgraded to Lady Mary. It wasn't her fault, but legitimacy, like monarchy itself, had very little to do with fairness. Then there were the gray areas, the royal bastards who weren't royal enough to rule, but too royal to ignore. Take Henry Fitzroy, the acknowledged illegitimate son of Henry VIII. Henry adored him, gave him land, titles, and even considered naming him heir. He was the ideal Tudor son. Loyal, healthy, and very much not a daughter. Unfortunately, He died of tuberculosis at 17, and that was that. His death left Henry VIII in the awkward position of realizing that he'd executed, divorced, or alienated nearly every other person who could carry his name. In the end, the Tudor dynasty would sputter out entirely, which, if we're being honest, was probably karmic balance for naming your son Fitzroy, literally son of the king, as if daring fate to intervene. But the real fascination of royal bastards lies not just in their misfortune, but in how society bent itself to accommodate them. In the medieval and Renaissance worlds, bloodline was everything, so when kings had illegitimate children, entire bureaucratic systems developed to manage them. There were polite euphemisms, natural sons, children of grace, of the left hand. There were laws allowing legitimization by royal decree, if it became politically useful, and there were even orders of chivalry and court positions reserved for them. For example, in Spain and Portugal, illegitimate royal sons often became commanders of military orders, prestigious roles that kept them close to power, but out of the line of succession. They were not, as you might imagine, constantly hacking away. Most towns, outside of the very busy, very bloody capitals, only had a handful of executions a year. Maybe one for a murderer, another for a thief who'd made a habit of it, and perhaps one poor soul accused of witchcraft when the mood was particularly superstitious. So what did the executioner do the other 360 days of the year? The answer, as with most medieval professions, is a little bit of everything, and none of it very glamorous. Executioners were often required to live on the edge of town, both literally and socially. Their houses sat by the gates, or near the gallows field, which, if you think about it, is a sort of occupational hazard. No one really wanted to live near the place where people died, except the man who made it happen. Even so, the position was strangely stable. Executioners were municipal employees. They had a salary, they had rights, and occasionally they even had fans. Some were minor celebrities, known for their precision or their mercy, or just for the fact that they'd managed to keep their heads attached while removing everyone else's. Take, for example, Franz Schmidt, the most famous of all executioners, who worked in Nuremberg in the late 1500s. He kept a journal, which is how we know exactly how many people he executed. 394. A neat, round number for a man who loved order. But between those deaths, Schmidt did something that might surprise you. He was a doctor. Yes, the executioner was also the town's unofficial surgeon. It sounds contradictory. Healing by day, killing by order. But in the medieval mind, it wasn't so strange. He knew anatomy better than most physicians. After all, he'd seen the inside of more people than anyone else. And, in a time when licensed medicine was rare and expensive, who else could you call when you needed a bone reset or an abscess drained? So when there were no executions, Franz Schmidt treated the sick. He made herbal poultices, stitched wounds, and set broken limbs. His patients came quietly, often after dark, because of course they did. Executioners were considered dishonorable, not evil, but unclean. They were necessary, yet unwanted, a social paradox. Wrapped in a leather apron, they couldn't attend church with others. They couldn't marry into respectable families. Sometimes they weren't even allowed to sit at a public inn, yet the same people who shunned them might appear at their door a week later, begging for a cure, a signed confession, or the swift, merciful death of a condemned friend. It's a lonely life, too. Imagine, but it also had perks. Executioners received fringe benefits, literally the fringes of condemned. Criminals. They were allowed to keep the clothes of the executed, sometimes even their belongings. They could claim the rope used for hanging, the coins found in pockets, or the scraps of clothing cut away. And yes, they could sell the body parts, because in the Middle Ages, dismembered remains were not just gruesome, they were profitable. The fat of executed. Criminals was believed to have healing properties. It could be turned into salve for arthritis or used in charms for protection. People paid for it, because people will pay for almost anything, given enough desperation and folklore. One might imagine the executioner sitting at his table in the quiet evening, rendering human fat into ointment, labeling jars in careful handwriting. Somewhere outside, the gallows creaks softly in the wind. It's all very relaxing, if you ignore the ingredients list. Of course, not all executioners were as industrious as Franz Schmidt. Some were drunks, thugs, or petty criminals themselves. Many got the job by being spared their own execution, on the condition that they take up the axe instead. It was a brutal kind of career pivot. Imagine being condemned for theft, then offered a promotion instead of a punishment. Congratulations, you're now the official head remover of the city. Naturally, this led to varying levels of professionalism. Some executioners botched their work. Others were more interested in drinking than decapitating. And when business was slow, many simply opened taverns. Yes, it turns out the hangman's side hustle was often hospitality. They brewed beer. They rented rooms. They kept pigs, which they slaughtered with unnerving skill. They farmed. They cobbled shoes. They did whatever paid the bills between public spectacles. There's something quietly tragic about it. The man hired to uphold divine justice, reduced to selling ale to the same townsfolk who cross themselves when he walks by. Still, many made good money. A skilled executioner could earn more than a carpenter or even a merchant. The town needed him. They might hate him, but they paid him on time. Let's drift for a moment to a smaller town, say, somewhere in 14th century France. The scaffold is empty. The jail is quiet. The hangman is sitting by his door, sharpening his sword, not because he needs to, but because it's what he knows how to do. Children pass by on the other side of the street. They whisper. He smiles, a little sadly, because despite everything, he's just another man waiting for work. And in the meantime, there are always animals to butcher, fences to mend, and maybe, if he's lucky, someone brave enough to come for a medical consultation. But of course, there was another part of the executioner's job that kept him busy even without executions. Torture. Interrogations. They called them, because in medieval Europe, truth was often considered a physical substance, one that could be extracted through sufficient pressure. Executioners were expected to conduct interrogations for the courts, stretching, crushing, burning, or breaking suspects until confessions conveniently emerged. This was work that required, disturbingly enough, a certain finesse, too little pain, and the prisoner said nothing, too much, and they might die before confessing. The ideal torturer was methodical, calm, and precise. Almost artistic, which, of course, made the executioner the perfect man for the job. So when there were no executions, there were always interrogations. And when there were no interrogations, there were amputations, or maybe a few teeth to pull, or leeches to apply, because somehow, in the labyrinth of medieval justice and medicine, all roads led to the same man, the one everyone feared, and the one everyone eventually needed. Let's drift over to something a little more human. Executioners, for all their grim reputation, were often family men. The profession was hereditary, passed from father to son, sometimes for generations. The sons didn't always have a choice. No one else would marry into the family. So the line continued within its own small circle. There are records of children apprenticed to their fathers at age 10, learning how to swing a sword cleanly, how to calculate the angle of a neck, how to speak softly to the condemned before the final moment. There's something strangely tender about it. A father teaching his son mercy, precision, and how to stand just far enough from the blood to keep his boots clean. And on quiet days, when there were no executions, perhaps they fished together, or mended tools, or just waited, because in the end, even death takes holidays. What happened to royal mistresses when they got old? The gilded years tonight. We're drifting back to the soft candlelight and velvet corridors of royal courts, the kind that smelled faintly of perfume, wax, and scandal. You know the stories already. Kings and queens, power and pageantry, grand affairs that moved nations and ruined lives. But tonight, we're not following the kings. We're following the women who stood just to the side of the throne. The royal mistresses. The glittering, whispered about companions who shaped politics from behind embroidered curtains. Women adored, envied, and sometimes, very quietly, destroyed. And we're asking the question nobody likes to think about in stories of beauty and power. What happened when they got old? Because in a world where your worth depended entirely on youth, charm, and the attention of one extremely fickle monarch, the answer is rarely pleasant, so get comfortable, dim the lights, and let's drift back to the age of powdered wigs, dangerous secrets, and women who learned, too late, that the crown always loves you conditionally. Let's start gently. In the glittering court of Louis XV of France, the man who had so many mistresses that the French nobility began referring to them as if they were government offices. There was, quite literally, a chief mistress, and occasionally a deputy mistress, depending on how the king's health was holding up. The most famous of them all was Madame de Pompadour. Her real name was Jeanne Antoinette Poisson, which is French for fish, which tells you everything you need to know about how unforgiving the French language can be. She was beautiful, witty, ambitious, and, perhaps most importantly, endlessly adaptable. She understood that the true art of being a royal mistress wasn't seduction. It was survival. When she first caught the king's eye, she was 23, a perfect age for Versailles. Old enough to be fashionable, young enough to still be considered delightful. She quickly became not just Louis XV's lover, but his confidant, advisor, decorator, and, somehow, project manager. She arranged his entertainments, his renovations, and sometimes even his emotional schedule. And for nearly 20 years, she managed to remain indispensable, even when she was no longer physically involved with the king, because, of course, age came, quietly, as it always does. By her mid-30s, Pompadour began to fade from the romantic side of the king's life. She was sickly, often tired, and the king, in his eternal pursuit of distraction, moved on to younger companions. But Pompadour, being cleverer than most, transformed herself. She shifted from lover to friend, from passion to partnership. She learned that when beauty expires, influence can still endure, if you know how to rebrand. So while other mistresses were dismissed the moment the king looked elsewhere, Pompadour stayed. She built alliances with ministers, commissioned art and architecture, and eventually became something almost respectable. A political force wrapped in satin. When she died, the king wept, not for his lost mistress, but for his oldest friend. And in a way, that's one of the better endings this story offers, because most royal mistresses didn't get happy retirements. They got replaced. Brutally, publicly, and often without so much as a goodbye. Once a new favorite appeared, the old one might be sent off with a gift, an estate, maybe a pension, essentially the royal equivalent of a severance package. The polite term was retirement to the country, which sounds lovely until you realize the country usually meant exile, loneliness, and a large, empty house filled with regret. Sometimes, if they were lucky, the king stayed on friendly terms. If they were unlucky, they became a national joke. One of the most infamous examples comes from England. Let's drift there next. We're in the 17th century now, the Restoration era, when the monarchy had returned from exile, determined to make up for lost time. And King Charles II of England was doing exactly that. Charles had mistresses in every corner of London. Actresses, courtesans, aristocrats. He gave them titles, jewels, palaces, and, occasionally, children. He seemed to believe that a lively court required at least one scandal per week, preferably involving himself. The most famous of his mistresses was Barbara Palmer, better known as the Duchess of Cleveland. She was passionate, extravagant, and widely regarded as a nightmare. But Charles adored her for a while. Then, naturally, she aged. Not dramatically, not suddenly. Just enough to remind the court that she was no longer the shiny new thing. And as her beauty faded, her reputation followed. The same men who had bowed to her at court now whispered about her temper, her vanity, her debts. Eventually, Charles replaced her with a younger, quieter favorite. Barbara, refusing to fade gracefully, fought back. She stormed through palaces, insulted rivals, and occasionally threw objects at the king himself. It was not her best era. Eventually, she was exiled from court. She lived out her later years surrounded by her illegitimate children, a small fortune, and an enormous amount of bitterness. A queen without a kingdom, still rehearsing old arguments in rooms where no one listened anymore. But the pattern wasn't just English or French. It was universal. Royal fatend. Mistresses existed in almost every monarchy that allowed men to have power and money, which, historically, was all of them. They were elevated to dizzying heights on the strength of a smile. And then, often within a few years, they were discarded, quietly, like yesterday's political alliance. A few, like Madame de Pompadour, managed to pivot. A few became patrons of the arts, philanthropists, or even advisors, but most slipped into obscurity. Because when your entire career is built on being the most desirable woman in a kingdom, there's no job training for what comes next. Let's drift east for a moment, to the Russian court of the 18th century, a place of frost, furs, and truly staggering amounts of gossip. Before she became Catherine the Great, young Catherine was a German princess with an ambitious streak and a deeply unhappy marriage. Her husband, the future Peter III, was, let's say, not well suited to romantic partnerships. So Catherine filled the emotional and political void with lovers, many of them, and, after she seized the throne, through what might charitably be called a coordinated marital misunderstanding, she continued to surround herself with handsome men, one at a time, of course. For decorum's sake, each lover was younger, charming, and, most importantly, politically harmless. Catherine would lavish them with gifts, titles and land, and when she tired of them, she retired them comfortably. Her system was almost bureaucratic. She'd grant them an estate, arrange a marriage, and send them away with warm goodbyes. And within a few months, there would be another. It was a remarkably stable rotation, efficient, even, and in a world where most royal mistresses were discarded without ceremony, Catherine's lovers were the rare few who retired rich, respected and alive, because Catherine was, above all, a woman who understood management. But for every Catherine, there were dozens of women whose names faded before their portraits even cracked. In France, Madame du Barry, the last official mistress of Louis XV, provides a particularly sad example. She was beautiful, charming, and not particularly noble. She'd been raised in poverty, and her ascent to the royal bed was considered an outrage by almost everyone with a family tree older than a century. The king adored her, though, and showered her with gifts. Diamonds, mansions, gowns so heavy with embroidery that servants had to help her move. And then, one morning, the king died. Suddenly, she wasn't the royal mistress anymore. She was just a woman with expensive jewelry and a target on her back. The court turned on her instantly. She was exiled from Versailles and forced into a quiet, lonely retirement. Her titles were stripped, her allies evaporated, and the palace she'd ruled over was locked behind her. Years later, when the French Revolution came, her name resurfaced, not as a beauty, but as a symbol of the monarchy's decadence. She was executed by guillotine in 1793. When asked for her final words, she supposedly said to the executioner, "One moment, monsieur, don't hurt me." A fitting end for someone who'd spent her life navigating pain with grace. And so, the story repeats itself, over and over. A woman adored, then ignored, elevated, then erased. The pattern is almost comforting in its predictability. If you don't think too hard about it, there's something quietly tragic about the way beauty and power decay at different speeds. A king can grow old and be called wise. Mistress grows old and becomes forgotten. It's not just about vanity, it's about visibility. When your survival depends on being seen, fading is a kind of death. He grew into one of the most famous military commanders of the 16th century, leading the Holy League to victory at the Battle of Lepanto, defeating the Ottoman fleet in one of the largest naval battles in history. Still, not all of them disappeared completely. Some mistresses outlived their kings and found a kind of peace in obscurity. They built gardens, they read novels, they hosted small salons where no one bowed and no one bowed out. Early, they became old women who, occasionally, would look at the portraits of their younger selves and wonder how much of that girl had been real. And sometimes, quietly, they'd smile, because for a few brief years they had held a kingdom in their hands and in their bed. And that was something no one could quite take away. How did people survive winter before central heating? Tonight, we're drifting back to a time before thermostats, heated blankets, or even the faintest idea of insulation as we know it. A time when keeping warm was less about comfort and more about survival. So, find a cozy spot, pull the blanket a little tighter, and settle in. Because tonight, we're stepping softly into a world where the long, dark months of winter were something to be endured, not enjoyed. Let's drift back to medieval Europe. The air is cold, not brisk, not refreshing, cold in the way that sinks into your bones and stays there. The kind of cold that makes you question your life choices, even if all you did was wake up that morning. For most of human history, winter wasn't something you waited out by the fire with hot cocoa. It was a season-long campaign against hunger, sickness, and frostbite. And if you were lucky, you only lost feeling in your toes temporarily. So how did people manage before the miracle of central heating? Well, in short, they didn't very well. But they were creative, desperate, and, on occasion, surprisingly ingenious. The great indoors, sort of. Let's start with the medieval home, which, by our modern standards, was a nightmare of heat loss. Picture a drafty wooden structure, a roof that leaks at the first sign of rain, and gaps in the walls wide enough for the local wildlife to register as co-tenants. Insulation wasn't a concept yet. If there was something between you and the wind, it was purely decorative. Peasants, who made up the vast majority of the population, often shared their one-room cottages with livestock. Chickens, goats, maybe even a cow if you were lucky. Not because they were emotionally attached to their animals, though that probably helped during the long nights, but because animals generate heat. A cow could put out roughly as much warmth as a small wood stove. So, yes, the average medieval winter evening involved huddling beside your family, a few sheep, and an ever-present smell of manure. But before you judge too harshly, it worked, and it kept you alive. The floor was often dirt. The walls? Wattle and daub, basically a fancy term for sticks covered in mud. The thatched roof was flammable, damp, and full of bugs. But when you closed the door, usually just a plank on hinges, the temperature inside might rise a few crucial degrees above freezing. And in winter, that was luxury. The central fire and the smoke problem. The heart of any medieval home was the hearth. It was both the kitchen and the heating system, and sometimes, if you were feeling daring, also the source of your chronic lung problems. Most early homes had no chimney. The smoke from the fire simply drifted upward and filled the room until it found its way out through a hole in the roof. Which sounds bad, and it was, but the upside was that the thick smoke actually helped preserve the wood beams by keeping insects away. So yes, people essentially marinated themselves in smoke for the greater good of architecture. The fire burned all day and all night, tended carefully. You couldn't just let it die out. Starting a new fire was hard work, and it wasted precious kindling. So at night, people would cover the embers with ash, a process called banking the fire, to keep it smoldering until morning. If you woke up and found your fire dead, your day was already ruined. And speaking of mornings, imagine waking up to ice on the inside of your walls. That wasn't uncommon. In castles, in peasant huts, in monasteries, everyone knew that particular misery of cold so deep that your breath hung visibly in the air. But let's not skip the upper classes, because if you're thinking kings and queens had it any better, well, that depends on how you define better. The royal chill castles, for all their grandeur, were basically giant stone refrigerators. They looked impressive, sure. Towering walls, echoing halls, tapestries fluttering gently in the draught. But comfort was not part of the design. Thick stone held in cold far longer than it held heat. Even in the great halls, with roaring fires the size of small cars, only those standing directly in front of the flames felt any real warmth. Step back a few feet, and you were once again part of the frozen landscape. There are accounts of servants in royal households constantly rotating positions, standing near the fire until their front was warm, then turning around to thaw the back. It was a kind of slow, human rotisserie method. Royal bedrooms were often enormous, echoing spaces with high ceilings, great for grandeur, terrible for warmth, which is why beds themselves became the central hub of winter survival. Beds, the original insulation fortresses. Medieval beds were enormous for a reason. They weren't just for sleeping. They were for surviving. Wealthy people slept surrounded by heavy curtains, sometimes made of wool or velvet, designed to trap whatever warmth their bodies could generate. The bed was raised off the ground, partly for status, but also because cold air sinks. Beneath the bed, sometimes a pot of coals glowed gently. A medieval version of an electric blanket, if you will. Peasants didn't have that luxury, of course, but they had something else, human clustering. Families, sometimes including servants, children, and possibly a dog, would all sleep in the same bed, or at least the same general pile. 3 in a bed was not scandalous. It was practical. The saying, "cold enough to freeze the bedclothes," wasn't just poetic. Bed linens often froze overnight if you strayed too close to the wall. And when you woke up, your breath might have formed a thin layer of frost on the blankets. But there was one thing medieval people mastered: layers. Dressing for survival winter clothing was less about fashion, more about survival cosplay. Wool was the undisputed king of fabrics. It was warm even when damp, and you could keep layering it until you resembled a particularly shapeless sheep. Linen undergarments went next to the skin, absorbing sweat and grime. Over that, several layers of wool. And if you were very rich, maybe fur, fox, rabbit, or even ermine, which was so prestigious that entire royal decrees were written about who was allowed to wear it. Hoods were popular too, not the dramatic cinematic kind, but more of a fabric funnel that covered everything except the face. And in some places, especially among peasants, people wore straw stuffed inside their clothes for extra insulation. Yes, straw, the same material used for bedding and animal stalls. It itched terribly, but again, warmth first, dignity later. Socks were rare, but foot wraps, strips of cloth wound tightly around the feet, did the job. Shoes were simple leather, which meant wet feet were inevitable. And gloves? Forget gloves. Most people simply pulled their sleeves down and tucked their hands inside. Food as warmth in winter. Food wasn't just sustenance. It was heat, morale, and medicine all at once. The colder months meant stews, endless stews, simmering for hours over the hearth. A single pot might contain meat, vegetables, and whatever odds and ends survived the winter stores. People even had a concept known as perpetual stew, where the pot was never fully emptied. New ingredients were simply added daily, sometimes for months on end. It sounds horrifying to modern ears, but it worked. Hot drinks were rarer, since tea and coffee hadn't yet reached Europe, but mulled wine was popular among those who could afford it. Spices like cinnamon and cloves were believed to warm the blood, though they mostly just signaled you had money. For peasants, the main winter drink was warm ale, a murky, mildly alcoholic beverage that was probably safer than water and provided a little warmth, or at least the illusion of it. Let's drift over to the monks' monasteries. In theory, had some of the best heating systems of the medieval world. In practice, that meant they were still cold, just slightly less miserable. Monks rose before dawn for prayer, in unheated stone chapels. They wore layers of thick wool, and sometimes slept in their robes to save time. Fires were permitted only in certain areas, like the kitchen or the infirmary. The library, where monks copied manuscripts for hours on end, was famously freezing. Scribes sometimes wore fingerless gloves and held small candles near their hands to keep their fingers nimble enough to write. The combination of ink, wax, and frostbite must have made for some very cranky calligraphy, but of course, monks had one major advantage: routine. The human body adapts, and, in an odd way, the cold became part of the rhythm of devotion, all while carrying the label bastard for life. But if it bothered him, he never showed it. He wore it like a badge, the mark of someone who'd fought for everything he had. And that, in a way, is what defines so many of these stories. Quiet resilience. Royal bastards lived on the border between power and obscurity. They were reminders that kings sinned. Queens forgave, sometimes, and bloodlines were never quite as pure as they claimed to be. Take Don Juan of Austria, the illegitimate son of Emperor Charles VI, born to a servant woman, raised in secret, and eventually acknowledged by the emperor himself. So, tonight, As we drift through the candlelit corridors of royal palaces, we'll meet a few more of them, the forgotten, the favored, and the inconvenient, the ones who rose above scandal, and the ones history pretended not to notice. Because while the crown might have denied them legitimacy, history eventually gave them something far better. Before we drift into the later centuries, when people began to get inventive with their heating solutions, from medieval bedpans full of hot coals to early central heating systems that nearly burned entire palaces down. A toothless beginning tonight. We're drifting back to a time before dentists, before toothpaste, and long before the comforting hum of an electric toothbrush. So, get comfortable. Dim the lights. Maybe sip some water. Or wine, if you're in a medieval mood. Because tonight, we're exploring a small but rather painful corner of the human past. What did medieval people do when they lost their teeth? Now, the short answer is, they suffered. The long answer, which we'll be unraveling gently over the next hour or so, involves honey, superstition, animal bones, and at least one person who thought urine was a good mouthwash. Naturally, they made it worse. Let's start with the basics. In medieval Europe, dental hygiene was, to put it kindly, experimental. People didn't really understand what teeth were. They knew they hurt sometimes, and they knew they fell out eventually. But the concept of oral bacteria, or plaque, wouldn't appear until many centuries later. If your tooth ached in the 13th century, the likely explanation was that a worm had crawled into it. Yes, a literal worm, tiny, invisible, and malicious. It was believed that toothworms burrowed into molars to gnaw from within. A medieval dentist's version of "it's all in your head." And the treatments? They ranged from the bizarre to the genuinely excruciating. Some healers suggested fumigating the mouth, holding your open jaw over a steaming mixture of herbs and sulfur to smoke out the worm. Others prescribed rinsing with vinegar and salt, or rubbing roasted onions on the gums. One 12th century remedy involved heating a metal needle and touching it directly to the bad tooth. It didn't kill the worm, but it probably killed the pain, and possibly the patient's will to live. It's worth noting that losing your teeth wasn't a rare event. Diets were rough on the mouth. Medieval bread was ground with stone mills, so even fine flour contained grit. Every bite of bread was a subtle form of sandpaper, slowly filing down enamel. Combine that with mead, sugar, if you were wealthy, and complete indifference to brushing, and by middle age, most people were well on their way to being toothless. But here's where things get interesting. Not everyone accepted toothlessness quietly, especially not the wealthy. Let's drift to the 16th century, when false teeth began making cautious appearances among Europe's elite. They were, frankly, terrible. The earliest dentures were made from animal bone or ivory. A noble might grin at you with a mouthful of carved walrus tusk, which was elegant until it began to rot. Ivory absorbs moisture, you see, and after a few weeks, your beautiful smile would smell faintly of wet dog. The more ambitious craftsmen used teeth taken from corpses. Yes, real human teeth, pulled from the recently deceased and repurposed for the living. These were known as Waterloo teeth in later centuries, named after soldiers whose bodies supplied an unfortunate market. But the practice began much earlier, quietly, in Europe's medieval cities. Imagine it. A noble woman attending Mass, smiling politely, wearing a delicate silk veil, and behind that demure expression, a borrowed smile from a man who died of plague. But before we get ahead of ourselves, let's return to the ordinary people, peasants, monks, and craftsmen, who didn't have the luxury of corpse dentistry. When they lost their teeth, they adjusted. Medieval diets were surprisingly soft. Porridges, stews, and pottages made up the bulk of daily meals, especially for the poor. Bread was soaked in broth. Meat, when available, was boiled until it surrendered. A toothless man could still eat, slowly, carefully, as long as he didn't mind swallowing a lot of mush. For those who did mind, the options were creative. Some used wooden pegs or wax plugs to fill in visible gaps. Others stuffed wool into empty sockets, partly for comfort and partly to prevent cold air from entering the head, which was thought to cause illness. And when pain struck, remedies came from everywhere: church, kitchen, and superstition. You could pray to Saint Apollonia, the patron saint of dentistry. Her story was appropriately unpleasant. In the 3rd century, she was tortured by having all her teeth pulled out. The church later decided she was the perfect spiritual ally for anyone with a toothache. So people carved her image, whispered her name during sleepless nights, and wore her tiny portraits around their necks, just in case divine dentistry worked faster than herbal medicine. If you preferred folk magic, though, there were plenty of options. You could tie a frog to your jaw. Yes, an actual frog. According to one 14th century manuscript, if you bound a live frog against your cheek and recited a short prayer, the pain would pass into the beast. Whether it worked or not is unclear, but it certainly kept your neighbors from standing too close. Others recommended carrying the tooth you'd lost in a linen pouch as protection from further decay, or, and this one's lovely, spitting into a running stream to wash away the ache. If you didn't have a stream, a blacksmith's anvil would do. Spit on the metal and say, "Smith, Smith, take my toothache." And if that didn't work, well, at least you'd made a new friend at the forge. Now, medieval medicine wasn't all nonsense. There were early attempts at real treatment. Physicians trained at Salerno or Paris sometimes prescribed mouth rinses made from wine, myrrh, and sage. These mixtures had mild antiseptic qualities, so they probably helped, though they cost more than most peasants earned in a week. Meanwhile, in Islamic Spain, physicians like al-Zahrawi were writing detailed treatises on dental tools and surgical methods. that were centuries ahead of the rest of Europe. But the majority of Europeans relied on the local barber. Barbers didn't just cut hair. They performed surgery, bloodletting, and tooth extraction. Their tools were simple: iron tongs, a steady hand, and a willingness to ignore screaming. Extraction was brutal but effective. The barber would grip the tooth, twist, and pull. Sometimes the tooth broke, and he'd go back in with a chisel. Occasionally an entire section of jaw came out. No anesthesia, no sterilization, just the faint comfort of being told to hold still. When done, he'd wipe the blood away with a cloth and offer a sip of ale. Payment was usually a few coins or a chicken. If you lived through it, congratulations, you were cured. It's worth remembering that this pain wasn't confined to peasants. Even kings suffered. Henry III of France was so terrified of toothache that he kept jars of strange pastes, one made of coral and burnt eggshells, to rub on his gums. Catherine de Courtisay, Medici reportedly lost several teeth to constant sugar consumption, but continued eating candied violets because, well, she was Catherine de' Medici. In England, Elizabeth's teeth turned black from her love of sweets, and yet her courtiers began blackening their own teeth with soot to imitate her. Because nothing says devotion like pretending you have royal tooth decay. Let's drift a little further east, to the medieval Slavs and Vikings. They took a different approach. Viking skeletons show filed and carved teeth, deliberate decorations etched into enamel, possibly for ritual or intimidation. Imagine grinning at your enemies with a mouth full of carefully filed lines, like the world's most aggressive dental art. By contrast, Slavic healers believed that toothache came from spirits trapped in the jaw. They'd chant to drive the spirits out, or bury the tooth in the forest to keep it from haunting the owner. Across Europe, losing teeth was not just painful, it was symbolic. In many cultures, teeth represented vitality. To lose them was to edge closer to death. Old proverbs warned of toothless wisdom, the kind that came too late to be enjoyed. In some rural communities, if a child lost a tooth, it was thrown onto the roof and replaced with a wish to grow a strong one. The tooth fairy, in a distant, glittery way, is a softened descendant of these superstitions. By the late medieval period, personal grooming became more fashionable. Merchants in Italian cities began selling tooth powders made from ground coral, burnt bread, or crushed shells. They worked, to a degree, until you realized that scrubbing your enamel with powdered rock was, in fact, a terrible idea. The scent of forgotten perfume. There's something haunting about that image. The empty apartment, the fading perfume, the folded gowns. For years, she'd been the most talked-about woman in the kingdom. And now, even the servants hesitated to say her name aloud. It's not a tragedy in the grand sense. No wars were lost over it. but it's a small, human kind of tragedy, a reminder that power without title is a candle without a holder. Bright for a moment, and then gone, leaving only a faint trace in the air. Still, it was progress, and there was always the fallback remedy of rinsing with urine, human or animal. Depending on availability, it was said to whiten teeth and prevent decay. And technically, it did. Urea breaks down into ammonia, which can bleach stains. So, in an accidental way, they were on to something. It just didn't smell like something you'd want near your face. Let's pause for a moment and imagine what that must have felt like. To grow up in a palace, surrounded by your half-siblings, eating from the same gold plates, and know that you were, officially, less real than they were. To be told that you shared your father's blood, but not his name, that your future would depend entirely on his mood and his wife's tolerance. It must have been a strange existence, a mix of luxury and loneliness. It was a delicate balancing act, honor without danger, privilege without ambition, and yet some of them managed to build identities that outshone their fathers. When the crown went cold tonight, we're drifting back into the royal bedchamber. Though not in the exciting way that phrase might suggest. This isn't about love or even passion. It's about what happened after the banquets ended, after the coronation glow faded, after the king, quite literally, stopped breathing. Because tonight, we're talking about the women history, politely forgot the moment the crown went cold. Royal mistresses. They were adored, hated, envied, and quietly blamed for nearly everything that went wrong in a kingdom. They had jewels, influence, and palaces for a while. And then, one morning, the king died, and everything changed. So, dim the lights, settle in, and let's drift back to the centuries when a royal mistress could go from the most powerful woman in Europe to a political inconvenience before breakfast. Royal mistresses were the unofficial queens of Europe, at least until they weren't. They existed in a strange in-between world. Not wives, not servants, and not quite free. They had no legal claim to anything, yet often had more power than the actual queen, and in life, setis, that could be intoxicating. But in death, his death, it could be catastrophic. When a king died, everything about his court shifted instantly. Factions that had been silent for years suddenly came alive. Ministers switched loyalties, and somewhere, behind a bolted door, a royal mistress quietly realized that she had no protection anymore. Let's begin, softly, with one of the more famous examples, the fall of Madame de Pompadour Jeanne. Antoinette Poisson, better known as Madame de Pompadour, was the glittering heart of 18th century France. She met King Louis XV at a masked ball, because of course she did, and soon became not only his mistress, but his closest confidant. For nearly 2 decades, she reigned unofficially at Versailles. She arranged operas, decorated palaces, advised on foreign policy, and introduced new hairstyles that looked like architectural projects. But by the 1760s, her health was fading, and so was the king's affection, at least in the physical sense. To her credit, she handled it gracefully. She remained his friend, his political ally, and even arranged new mistresses for him when he grew restless. Because nothing says loyalty like curating your own replacements. When she died of tuberculosis in 1764, Louis reportedly wept. But had the timing been reversed? Had he died first? Pompadour's life would have changed overnight. Her apartments would have been cleared out. Her income would have vanished. And the new king, whoever he was, would likely have preferred not to be reminded of her existence, which is exactly what happened to many women like her. The royal morning after, the moment the king died, his mistress became a ghost. If she was lucky, she'd been clever, securing estates, titles, or pensions while he still breathed. If she was unlucky, she found herself politely escorted out of the palace before lunch. In France, it was sometimes literal. Guards would appear at dawn, bow respectfully, and inform her that the new reign had begun. Without her, the new king, often the old one's son, had every reason to remove her. She represented scandal, gossip, and his father's sins. Keeping her around was like keeping an embarrassing family portrait in the throne room. So, she'd be encouraged to retire to the countryside, sometimes with a pension, sometimes without. And because royal mistresses were rarely young by then, power ages faster than faces, their later years were often quiet, lonely, and carefully forgotten. The Widow's Revenge, Barbara Villiers. Let's drift over to England for a moment, where royal mistresses were practically part of the job description. King Charles II, the Merry Monarch, had a collection of them. The most notorious was Barbara Villiers, the Countess of Castlemaine. Barbara was not subtle. She was tall, striking, and possessed the kind of arrogance that can only come from being certain you'll get away with it. And she usually did. She bore several of the king's children, bullied ministers, and insulted the Queen to her face. Charles adored her, then tolerated her, and eventually replaced her. But he still paid her debts. When he died in 1685, Barbara, now 50-something and still fond of drama, was left with very little. Her titles were hers, but her income wasn't. She'd been supported entirely by the king's generosity, which, like his pulse, had stopped. Her rivals at court celebrated. Her children were acknowledged by the new king, James II, but she herself was pushed aside, a relic of a too festive past. She spent her later years wandering Europe, aging gracelessly, quarreling with lovers, and trying to marry a younger man. She died in debt and relative obscurity, remembered mostly for her temper. Because that's another rule of royal mistressing. When history writes the story, you're either a temptress or a fool. Rarely both, and never neither. the pension problem in many cases. Mistresses did receive pensions, carefully worded, quietly approved, and often reduced later by accident. Parliaments and councils didn't like funding the memory of royal sin. For instance, Nell Gwyn, another of Charles II's companions, fared a little better. She'd been popular with the public, cheerful, funny, and very obviously not noble. Charles reportedly told his brother, "Let not poor Nellie starve," and so she didn't. But she did fade, as all favorites do, into gentle poverty. Mistresses who'd lived like queens often ended up managing small estates, or retreating to convents, or becoming, ironically, ladies-in-waiting to the actual queen, if the widow was feeling merciful. Some even remarried quietly, trading royal glamour for the stability of a middling noble husband, and many didn't. Because what exactly do you do after being the king's mistress? You can't return to ordinary society. You can't really dine at court again, and everyone who visits you either pities you or wants to borrow money. The lucky exceptions, of course. There were exceptions, because there always are. Madame du Barry, for instance, was the last mistress of Louis XV, the one who came after Pompadour. She was a former courtesan with impeccable survival instincts. When the king died of smallpox in 1774, she was quietly removed from Versailles within hours. But unlike many others, she managed to keep her fortune. For a while, she lived comfortably in a country estate, charming visitors, collecting art, and pretending to be apolitical. Until the French Revolution arrived, of course, and reminded her that Versailles never really forgets. She was guillotined in 1793, reportedly screaming for her life. A tragic end, yes, but at least she outlived the king by 19 years. Longer than most mistresses ever managed to remain relevant. Teenfeeding. Quiet ones, not every royal affair made it into gossip columns or court whispers. Some mistresses were discreet, almost painfully so. Take Henrietta Howard, the mistress of George II of Britain. She was intelligent, mild, and practical, qualities that rarely get statues. She endured years of neglect from her husband, then entered the king's service, where she became his mistress in the politest possible way. When George died, Henrietta didn't suffer scandal or exile. She simply retired to her estate at Marble Hill, lived quietly, entertained poets, and outlived almost everyone she knew. It was, in many ways, a happy ending, or at least a peaceful one, but it was rare. Because for every Henrietta Howard, there were 10 Barbara Villierses, left to wander Europe with fading pearls and unpaid bills. Mistresses versus queens, it's worth pausing here for a soft moment to notice the irony. Queens, too, often had miserable lives. They endured arranged marriages, infidelities, and the constant threat of being replaced. But when the king died, the queen became the dowager. She kept her title, her residence, her staff. The mistress, meanwhile, lost everything. Same man, same grief, possibly even genuine love. Very different afterlife. There's a lovely, slightly cruel symmetry in that. The queen had legitimacy without affection. The mistress had affection without legitimacy, and, in the end, neither was very happy. A royal habit that wouldn't die despite all this. The humiliation, the risks, the abrupt evictions, the role of royal mistress kept recurring, century after century. Because for kings, it worked. It gave them comfort, distraction, and sometimes even advice. And for ambitious women, it was one of the few routes to power that didn't involve a crown or a sword. But that power was always borrowed. It belonged to the king's heartbeat. And when that stopped, so did everything else. The morning after the monarchy in a broader sense. The fate of royal mistresses tells us something about monarchy itself. It depended on illusion, the illusion of permanence. Everyone at court acted as though things would stay the same forever. But the moment one body stopped breathing, the entire social order shifted like furniture in an earthquake. New faces replaced old ones. Old favorites became embarrassing reminders of yesterday's taste. And the mistress, who once whispered state secrets between kisses, now found herself politely ignored at court banquets. If she was invited at all. Sometimes she'd publish her memoirs, which was the 18th century equivalent of a tell-all podcast. Sometimes she'd enter a convent and find peace in prayer, or at least in quiet. Let's drift next time, through the corridors of Versailles again, to explore what happened when multiple mistresses competed for a dying king's attention, and how those rivalries ended when the crown changed heads, because, naturally, they made it worse. The scent of civilization tonight, we're drifting back to a place that believed it was the center of the world. A city of marble, wine, sweat, and ambition. So, settle in. Dim the lights. Maybe take a slow breath. Because tonight, we're asking one of history's least glamorous but most honest questions. How did people in ancient Rome actually smell? Now, you might imagine Rome the way Hollywood does. Gleaming temples, spotless togas, a faint scent of olives drifting through sunlit courtyards. But Rome, the real Rome, was an empire that ran on heat, bodies, and dirt, and it smelled exactly like that. Let's start with the obvious. There were millions of people crammed into a city without sewers, as we know them. There were some drains, yes, but most of Rome's waste was human, and it was everywhere. People dumped chamber pots into alleys. The Tiber River served as both a water source and a dumping ground. Public latrines existed, but they were communal. Long benches with keyhole openings, everyone sitting together in philosophical fellowship while flies buzzed overhead. And sometimes she'd simply fade into the countryside, her jewels pawned, her portraits gathering dust in a corridor somewhere. You'd think such a city would reek. And it did. But Romans, bless them, tried. They truly did. They loved smell. They talked about it constantly. Poets wrote about perfume. Philosophers complained about it. The wealthy wore it, bathed in it, even argued over which scent best conveyed dignity. Cicero once mocked a rival for smelling too expensive, saying he reeked of perfume, not virtue. It was the ancient equivalent of calling someone a little too moisturized to be trustworthy. So, what did the average Roman smell like? Probably layers, sweat, oil, smoke, and the faintest whisper of whatever herb they could afford. Let's begin where Romans began their day. The baths, the Roman bathhouse. The bath was Rome's answer to hygiene, social life, and gossip, all in one steamy package. Almost everyone went, rich, poor, even slaves when allowed. There were cold rooms, hot rooms, massage rooms, and rooms specifically for scraping yourself with a curved metal tool called a strigil. Soap, in the modern sense, didn't really exist. Instead, you'd oil yourself, usually with olive oil, then scrape off the dirt and sweat with the strigil. The result? Skin that was cleanish, but faintly greasy, like you'd been marinated, not washed. The oil was sometimes scented, if you could afford it, with rose, myrrh, or cardamom. But the cheaper options just smelled like olives. Warm, slightly rancid olives. After bathing, Romans would often douse themselves with perfume. Men and women alike used it lavishly. The wealthy imported exotic oils from Arabia and India, while others relied on local concoctions, mixtures of crushed flowers, resins, and wine. One popular scent was called nardinum, made from spikenard, an herb that smelled somewhere between earthy and musty. Another, succinum, was made from lilies and apparently went sour in the sun. So imagine walking through a crowded Roman forum on a hot day. A dense cloud of lilies, sweat, and ambition. Naturally, this created hierarchy. The rich smelled expensive. The poor smelled human. But the Romans noticed. In a society obsessed with status, scent became another way to display it. Wearing too much perfume could mark you as decadent. Wearing none could mark you as barbaric. The trick was to smell just scented enough to show you had money, but not so much that you seemed to be hiding decay. Let's drift a little closer to the reality of the city itself. The smell of Rome picture, a morning in the Subura, one of Rome's busiest neighborhoods. The streets are narrow, so narrow, in fact, that sunlight barely reaches the ground. Shops are opening. Bread is baking. Donkeys are relieving themselves in the street. Above you, apartments lean precariously inward, balconies almost touching. People dump pots of wastewater into the alley, sometimes with a shout of warning, sometimes without, and beneath your feet, a faint trickle of the Cloaca Maxima, Rome's great sewer, hums its endless, fragrant song. The smell? A complicated symphony of humanity. Smoke from cooking fires, leather from the tanneries, urine from the laundry vats. Yes, urine. Because Roman laundries used it to clean clothes. Here's how that worked. Fullers, who washed garments, collected urine from public jars placed around the city. Citizens were encouraged to contribute, because urine was full of ammonia, a natural cleaning agent. They'd soak the clothes in it, stomp them with their feet, rinse them in water, and hang them to dry. And afterward, they smelled surprisingly fresh, at least by Roman standards. In fact, Emperor Vespasian even taxed the urine trade. When his son Titus complained about it, he famously held up a coin and said, "Money does not smell," which is true, but everything else did. Personal hygiene. Now, Romans weren't filthy. They cared deeply about appearance. They brushed their teeth, though their toothpaste was unconventional. Common ingredients included crushed bones, oyster shells, charcoal, and, sometimes, salt. Some recipes called for urine, too, because of course they did. It worked, in a horrifying way. The ammonia in urine acted as a whitener. So if you ever wondered how wealthy Romans had bright smiles while living in a city of grime, the answer is chemical bleaching. For deodorant, they used perfumed oils, or simply washed more often. The wealthy had slaves dedicated to keeping them clean and fragrant. A Roman noblewoman might have one slave to anoint her with oil, another to comb her hair, another to sprinkle her with perfume. Personal space wasn't really a thing. And yet, beneath the layers of oils and flowers, everyone still carried a certain scent of life, because they were always sweating. The Roman climate was hot. The clothing, wool togas, layered tunics, was heavy, and daily life involved walking, talking, arguing, and gesturing dramatically in open forums. Even the emperors smelled human. Augustus reportedly took frequent baths and prided himself on his cleanliness. Nero, by contrast, drenched himself in perfume so strong that guests sometimes grew dizzy in his presence. It was less subtle fragrance and more olfactory assault. Perfume was power. To smell like cinnamon and roses in a world of sewage was to announce that you were above it. The scent of work now. Not everyone had the luxury of perfume. Some Romans lived their entire lives surrounded by the odors of their trade. Tanners, for instance, worked with animal hides soaked in urine and dung. Fishmongers spent their days knee-deep in brine. Bakers inhaled smoke. Blacksmiths, sweat and iron. A Roman poet once joked that you could tell a man's profession by standing downwind of him. Still, there was pride in smell. A soldier might reek of leather and sweat, but that meant discipline. A farmer might smell of earth, but that meant virtue. The only unacceptable smell was decay, literal or moral. home life inside the home. Scents were just as varied. A wealthy Roman villa might smell of incense, beeswax, and freshly crushed herbs. Cedar and myrtle were common air fresheners. Owners would burn them in small braziers to cover the less poetic smells of food, smoke, and humanity. Poorer homes smelled of what they had: cooking oil, stale bread, and the faint musk of animals, since chickens or goats were often kept indoors. Interestingly, Romans weren't bothered by the mingling of human and animal odors. To them, it was normal, part of the rhythm of life. What they couldn't tolerate was foreign smell, the scent of people they considered uncivilized. The Greeks smelled like garlic. Apparently, the Gauls smelled like butter, and the Egyptians, according to Roman gossip, smelled of incense. Each group had its olfactory stereotype, a form of prejudice disguised as poetry. The politics of perfume was more than fashion. It was politics. During the late Republic, moralists like Cato the Elder raged against luxury. He said men who wore perfume were half women, a serious insult in his day. Meanwhile, younger Romans delighted in imported scents: frankincense from Arabia, myrrh from Africa, cassia from India. Rome spent fortunes importing the ingredients of its vanity. In 1 year, the empire reportedly burned enough incense to bankrupt a province, all to make their homes smell divine. By the 1st century A.D., wearing perfume wasn't just acceptable, it was expected. Weddings were perfumed. Funerals were perfumed. When Nero's wife Poppaea died, he supposedly burned an entire year's worth of Arabia's incense for her funeral pyre, which, depending on your view of romance, was either touching or wasteful. But here's the irony. The more they tried to mask the city's scent, the more the contrast grew. Perfume didn't erase the smell of sewage. It just layered over it. Jasmine over rot, rose over sweat. Rome was always a mixture. Civilization and decay. Beauty and odor, side by side. A sensory empire for the Romans. Smell wasn't just a background experience. It was moral. Good smells meant purity, divinity, civilization. Bad smells meant corruption, barbarism, sin. So they perfumed their gods, their homes, even their pets. They burned incense before altars, anointed statues with oil, and sprinkled rose water on banquet floors so guests could tread on fragrance. But nothing was permanent. By morning, the perfumes faded, the drains overflowed, and the city smelled like itself again. Alive, complicated, a little disgusting, and deeply human. Let's drift over, next time, to the Roman banquet table, where smell became theater, and where the scent of wealth was measured not by gold, but by how many guests fainted from the fumes.